New Thinking Aloud, conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today I'd like to address the topic of paraphrenia and the alternatives to paraphrenia. Obviously, I've got to begin by defining what I mean by paraphrenia. It's a technical term of a psychodiagnostic category that refers to people who are perfectly normal in every way, but nevertheless, they maintain some form of psychotic delusion. And I first learned about this term from my good friend John Alexander, who has been interviewed on this program several times. Now, John is a person who has been identified by some people, mistakenly, in my opinion, as a government agent of disinformation, and he shrugs that off. I believe that John Alexander is being perfectly sincere when he debunks certain myths, and in particular myths associated with UFOs. But John and I both know people in our acquaintance who seem very normal, well-balanced, healthy people, and yet they hold certain belief systems which are completely at odds with a conventional, rationalistic view of the world. And a lot of these belief systems are common in the UFO community or in other metaphysical and spiritual communities. Well, to be honest with you, mainstream religion. How many people believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who arose from the dead? Now, that would be considered a paranoid belief, that would justify the label of paraphrenia if it weren't for the fact that it's socially sanctioned. That a lot of people who accept the idea of the resurrection do so because of they participate in a social group in which that's considered a reasonable and acceptable dogma for that group. But if you belong to some sort of fringe group, if you talk about resurrection of the dead in the context of Native American rituals or African shamanism, and I have programs on both of those, well, you might be regarded as a little delusional. But for our purposes today, I'm not referring to conventional religious beliefs, as bizarre as they may be when you pick them apart. I'm talking about the nature of reality itself. And the reason it's an issue right now is you will find on the New Thinking Aloud channel a number of upcoming interviews, for example, on Native American shamanism, where we do discuss the actual resurrection of dead animals, dead people, apports. And of course, there are upcoming interviews and previous interviews having to do with UFO-related abductions and encounters with alien beings. These are the sorts of things that would normally justify the label of paraphrenia on somebody, a perfectly normal person who talks about things that to a conventionally minded individual are impossible on the face of it. And if you believe in those things, well, you might be deluded, but even worse, you might be subject to some form of mental disease. And that's what the label paraphrenia implies. Now, there is a problem with that label because for the most part, in my studies of clinical psychology, a diagnosis of mental illness really only applies if the person is suffering, if the person is not able to function adequately in society. But in the case of the paraphrenia label, that's not the case. We're talking about well-functioning, healthy people. So, what is the alternative? And the alternative is one that seems When I grew up, I certainly remember my early days as a college student. I believed in a rational universe. I believed in the scientific method. I believed in trying to resolve the issues associated with cults and associated with strange belief systems and new religions by trying to look at them rationally. And in fact, that was one of the reasons I was drawn to parapsychology. But as I get more deeply into it, as I study, for example, the idealistic philosophy of some of our guests like Bernardo Kastrup, if I look at the writings of Paul Levy, who suggests that this world is a dream world, if I consider the interviews with Jason Reza Georgiani, who talks about the possibility that we are actually living inside of some sort of a simulated reality. In other words, there's somebody out there creating the simulation that we're part of, seductive as it may be. And that idea is now strongly supported by the findings of quantum physics. When I wrote my first book, The Roots of Consciousness, which was published in 1975, we talked then about Bell's theorem. The physicist Jack Sarfati actually wrote a section on the physics of consciousness for my book back then. And we discussed the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky paradox and Bell's theorem. It was just beginning to be tested at that point by physicists like John Clauser at Berkeley, who would hang out occasionally at the Institute for the Study of Consciousness where I lived. But now, some 45 years later, there have been numerous tests of Bell's theorem. And as we've discussed many times on New Thinking Aloud interviews, the implications of those tests are just staggering for what we understand the nature of reality itself to be. It's no longer possible to say that reality follows logic and rationality, because the results of all of these tests suggest that there is no such thing as an objective reality independent of our observations of it. That we are all swimming in a mutual reality that we share, but we're creating it by observing it. And as my friend Bernardo Kastrup would say, there's a kind of transpersonal consciousness greater than any individual, which is also responsible for the creation of this reality. But if the reality ultimately is based on consciousness rather than on the mechanistic principles that one might say underpin the physical universe, so that everything can be explained like rationally in terms of the billiard ball movement of all the tiny particles. At one time, it was thought that if we understood the position and momentum of every single particle, we could predict the beginning and the end of the entire universe. That no longer, I don't think anybody holds that view any longer. Reality itself is more malleable. So when people talk about things appearing and disappearing out of nowhere, the beings can suddenly enter into your bedroom and perform physical experiments on you and then vanish, that there's some kind of overlap between the dream world and the world of waking experience. These ideas, which seemed to be to exist only in the realm of fantasy literature and poetry, are now beginning to take on, to my way of thinking, certainly more of a respectable aura. That, in the novels of Philip Pullman, is a British novelist whose work I admire, he talks about an alternative world in which physics, as we think of it today, is known by a different name, and that name is experimental theology. And I think we're moving in that direction. So, yeah, I bring this up because I have to ask myself all the time when I have guests on, and I have an interview with one such guest scheduled in a few hours today, Angela Thompson-Smith, who has already talked about her remote viewing or telepathic communication with alien entities, and will be soon talking with me about her abduction experiences and the prospect that some abductions are actually being carried out by the U.S. government, things that I, for a long time, wanted to have no part of. Well, I could dismiss her as being a paraphrenic, or I could say, hold on here. Hold on. What have I myself experienced in my own research over 10 years with Ted Owens, the PK man? I have seen enough in my own life to know that I can't dismiss the idea that the dream-like, movie-like existence in which we're moving is far more malleable, far more flexible than would be considered, according to traditional Western Enlightenment rationalistic philosophy. That's my point. Not that I have formed a final opinion on any of this. I keep an open mind, and a skeptical open mind, as a matter of fact. But I think there's a big difference between honest skepticism and the tendency to want to debunk and dismiss, which I hear occasionally from viewers. Well, those are my thoughts. And, of course, I want to leave you with a question for yourself. And that is, how do you integrate some of the very bizarre stories that you will hear on this channel? How do you integrate those into your life? Do you notice within yourself a tendency to want to dismiss it? I want to dismiss alien abduction stories. They're uncomfortable. They're unpleasant. They seem as if, if you take them literally, you have to ask yourself if there aren't thousands, if not millions of people who are being abused by entities from hyperspace. I would prefer not to think about that. Well, but I do. I do think about it. I think it's worth considering ideas, even though they have unpleasant implications. And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for being with me.